Hi, everyone, and welcome to this installment of our speaker series. I am delighted to be able to welcome my dear friend and former colleague, Saikat Majumdar, who was kind enough to join us as a research associate in the department, and we're so lucky and privileged to have him. And I'm especially thrilled that we can talk about his brilliant new book today. You have had access to his bio. The book is called The Amateur Self-Making and the Humanities in the Postcolony. And I've had the joy and the privilege to read it recently over the past few days, especially, and it is absolutely a treasure trove of brilliant insights into our discipline, the discipline of literary studies and its history and its relationship to just reading and amateur forms of reading, obstructive forms of reading or misreading, misadventures or adventures with reading. So I can definitely recommend this book. You'll all want to read it definitely after you've heard Saikat speak as well. He is a very prolific writer. He's written several academic books, but he is also a novelist. So he's written 5 novels, most recently The Remains of the Body, that I'm not sure if it's out yet, Saikat, but it is 2024 is the...
Yeah, it's out. It came out in June, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so this book, The Amateur, you can really see is written by someone who straddles this divide between being a scholar and a critic himself and being a creative writer. So there's it's just a great joy to read this book just because of how compellingly and beautifully it is written as an academic text. Anyway, so this is just a great pleasure for me, and I welcome Saikat now to introduce the book to us himself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helene. Can you hear me all? Can you hear me clearly? Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's really so nice. I mean, I wish I could do this in person because I still have such wonderful memories of 6 months in the Western Cape last year at STIAS, where I got to meet Helene and remember our days teaching in Canada together. So that seems like another lifetime. But it's so nice to be here. Thank you, Helene, for doing this. And thank you, Hanta, for making this happen, so arranging. And thank you all for being here. So what I'll do briefly is to talk about the book for maybe about 15-20 minutes, and maybe for another 15-20 minutes, read a few short excerpts just to give a sense of what I'm trying to do. So I always like to say that, this book comes out of my multiple bad habits of writing. As Helene just said, I write many different things. I write novels, I write newspaper articles, I write academic books, I do book reviews. And in a strange way, this book actually has brought many things together, not just stylistically, as Helene so kindly mentioned it, but also thematically. So at one level, this is about my interest in the history of criticism, particularly in the history of reading, what kind of readings we do. And finally, I come up with this idea of as an act of failed reading, that ignorant reading, is that something in that? Then it also has something to do with my interest in higher education. I've been very interested in higher education in India. I've been involved in setting up India's first liberal arts university. I've been involved with the policy making at the national level. So I have an interest in that as well. And particularly I have an interest in the history of higher education in the British colonies, which obviously also includes South Africa, but also the entire British Empire, how certain policies were consistent across the British Empire. And finally, it also reflects my interest as a novelist in the sense a novel really gives a sense of how a human being is made. Self-making, the whole idea of self-making. Particularly 2 of my novels, The Firebird and The Scent of God, are called Bildungsromans. So obviously novels of education, coming of age stories. So I'm very interested in how this process of Bildung works. And the traditional Bildungsroman has been about the formation of the normative subject, the traditional European white male subject coming from a small town in Europe and then arriving at a big city, getting education, getting a job, getting married, and all that, and how certain postcolonial takes on it has kind of remapped it, has created a certain disruptive form of Bildung, that in the sense that the human subject, that normative human subject, never got made. Something disruptive and dangerous came out of it, and I think in some ways unconsciously I realize my novels often reflect that. So what it means is that it is, the book, the way Bloomsbury published it, is obviously it has a core academic audience, people interested in histories of reading, the idea of criticism as an amateur pursuit, postcolonial, making of the postcolonial subject, particularly in these territories. But it's also hopefully of general interest to anyone who is interested in reading, education, and any of these larger subjects, and how we, especially the Anglophone postcolonial subject, how we became what we are. So when it comes to higher education, my model has been what I call that scandalous unruly student, the unruly student who is kind of a shirking student, who shirks their curriculum, their jobs, but is actually a fantastically imaginative reader who sort of sits at the back benches and reads, but doesn't kind of fails at exams. There's a wonderful moment in the Indian filmmaker Satyajit Ray's film Pather Panchali, where this very poor rural boy Opu, he brings home a globe from a gift from his headmaster in his local school, village school. He's never seen a globe. So he brings it back to his mother, his widowed mother, who's bringing him up with a lot of hardship. And he's very excited. He's like, "Oh, mother, this is actually a globe. And you can see the city of Calcutta right here, and I'm going to go there to study." Um, and it's quite fascinating that that moment um, is this very poor rural boy's aspiration to become a kind of a world citizen, kind of holding that model of the world in this hut, in this very poor hut in a poor Indian village, is the kind of this aspiration. And this aspiration takes him to the city, where he becomes a very indisciplined kind of a reader. This is kind of chaotic. And this is kind of one of my theses, that for the aspiring postcolonial subject, from a remote part of, the colony, the kind of proper channels of education are not available. They often make mistakes. They are ignorant. They don't know what to read. They're often deprived of proper education. They're excluded for various reasons. But it's about this exceptional imaginative subject who has this incredible thirst to learn, to read, and how they read. And especially my particular interest is how, when you get a text, most often from a Western culture about which you know nothing, how do you read? What sense do you make? And that confusion, that mistakes, I think in my argument is kind of generative. Um, and at the same time, this ends up being a certain response to modern higher education in the British Empire, which is of course colonially structured. That it has this. There's a certain kind of bureaucratic model, an instrumental model, an exclusive model of education, which has often excluded people, for various reasons. Um, you know, um, and out of that exclusion, certain people, certain exceptional imaginative people, created this model of reading. And of course, this connects to the other belief that um, in the arts and artistic thought, no matter how much we institutionalize it, how much we professionalize it, um, there's always the amateur. The amateur always remains. There's always a kind of a dialectic between the amateur and the professional. So what I'm hoping is that this book becomes a kind of an alternative story of Western humanities across the expanse of the British Empire. And in some ways, it also revisits the story origin of post-colonial English literature, of which, I feel I carry the legacy in. And this alternative history is a history of mistakes, ignorance, accidents, failures, um, and out of all of this, a certain model of public intellectual comes into being. So, because in some senses, being in the public is also to perform a certain amateurism, and this is kind of part of their belief. Now, misreading is something that is obviously quite known in our discipline. In literary studies, message reading is clearly a key part of the story. I mean, it obviously goes back to hermeneutics, the whole origin of hermeneutics, where the whole idea is that, you know, linguistic study, literary study, all of these rhetorical studies, they go back to the interpretation of scriptures. And scriptures, hermeneutics is a forever fallible genre because nobody will ever know what God said. So God's words in any religion, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, any religion, um, you only have an imperfect version. So interpretation seeks out to, whether it's Talmudic scriptures or biblical study or whatever, the the desire to actually get the word right. And that, as we know, is the origin of hermeneutics, which becomes secularized through the early modern period to become literary study, to kind of give body to literary study. Um, Now, obviously, in the 20th century, I think the whole idea of depth, that a text is to be understood in its depth, that somehow meaning is always hidden. Meaning is never on surface. So whatever is on surface is not to be trusted. We must sort of unmask it. This has been the kind of governing principle of literary study, that we must somehow find meaning somewhere else. And I think one iconic moment for this model of thinking is Frederick Jamieson's Political Unconscious in 1981, where Jamieson uses both Freud and Lacan to kind of show that the big drivers, the big impulses behind meaning making are both invisible. One is unconscious, that's Lacan and Freud behind Lacan, and the other one is capital. That's the Marxist version. That the capital also, just the way Althusser and other theorists say, that it becomes invisible, but it creates this powerful myth and ideology that drives things. And I think that many critics feel that that Jamesonian moment has dominated literary criticism and theory for a long time, that we primarily go, interpretation has been either inside psychoanalysis or outside. Um, but I think in the 21st century, we've seen some dissatisfaction with um, this model of depth-driven reading, that the meaning is always in depth, you know. And I think some of the most best known expressions of this dissatisfaction is the culture of distant reading, as Franco Moretti has brought up, that why look at close reading? Why can't we look at distant reading? And of course, the distant reading is enabled by the methods of digital humanities, where you can read not 1, 2, 10, but 30,000 texts. You can run 30,000 novels through a computer software, and you can find models, you can find patterns, and that helps us. So that's been one model. Then Sharon Marcus and Stephen Best brought together this issue of representations, where they talked about surface reading, that why do we always look for meaning in depth? Meaning can also be on surface, and this of course kind of has some connections to what Susan Sontag said some few decades ago against interpretation, that interpretation is an act of translation. We need to look at the erotics of the surface. So there's that. At the same time, people like Rita Felsky have talked about, critique is overrated. Critique is always suspicious. Why can't we bring back enchantment? Why can't we bring back the whole simple act of being enchanted by a text? Why are we always suspicious? The Paul Ricoeur's idea of, hermeneutic of suspicion. Why are we always trying to find flaws and hidden? Let's not look at that way. So I think all of that, in a way, kind of has a background to what I'm trying to say. And what I'm trying to add here is the idea of what I call the flawed reading, the reading which gets things wrong, the reading which makes mistakes, or, in another way, the reading which is amateur reading. So let me just share my first slide and move on to the other slide here, to explain the idea of the amateur. um, so yeah, so if you can see my screen, what I'm trying to share here is that I think the whole idea of the amateur is quite fascinating, and I here I'm referring to this really wonderful book by Marjorie Garber called Academic Instincts, where she talks about that. She gives a really interesting history of the idea of the amateur, and one thing she points out is that there are certain domains in which the amateur has been trusted more or regarded higher than the professional. It's kind of ironical. And clearly you can see on the left, I have the image of, Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, and then Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple, these two detectives. Obviously, she talks about how amateur detectives are valued sometimes more than kind of the stodgy, boring policemen in uniforms. So they are kind of more interesting. Um, then, of course, we have the example of sports. So Olympics being the example that sports has often been a genre where the amateur sportsman who does it for love, because the word amateur obviously originates in love, the amateur is kind of seen as more prestigious. And clearly, aristocrats were often amateurs, professional sportsmen were often from the working class because they needed the mobility. And finally, the more explosive domain of politics. I was started thinking about it during the first Trump campaign, and we just saw, probably some of you might have seen the debate between Trump and Kamala Harris a few weeks ago, and I think the things haven't changed really. The whole idea that someone like Trump makes his case is that I'm an outsider. I don't belong here. And do not trust the seasoned politicians. Do not trust experts. That's what they've got you. And he's a celebrated case, but often politicians have harnessed this. I think Garber talks about the Minnesota governor who was a wrestler who just entered politics. So I'm sure there are instances of that in every country, that there's a certain kind of outsider coming in. And also then 2016, the Brexit, the British exit from European Union was very much also powered by a suspicion of expertise. That, oh, don't trust the economists, don't trust the experts. Look what they got us. Let's go with our national pride. Now, obviously, 8 years after that, it's kind of clear that things haven't gone so well of those who wanted amateur idea. But that's often in politics too. That's been a kind of a powerful thing. So the question is then, once we extend this idea of the amateur in the disciplines, we see a range of interesting results. Like clearly scientists writing novels are more credible than novelists doing science. I mean, if everyone has political opinions, does it mean that political science is not necessary as a discipline? What about practice-based disciplines like law, medicine, accountancy, what Immanuel Kant called the higher faculty, where you need its license from the state? Do they are they kind of a heightened professionalism that is the license? So that itself could have a very interesting discussion. Also, because I think when any discipline puts out a public face, it also performs a certain amateurism, you know, because in some ways, and and Garber talks about that too, and she says that it's not a non-professional amateurism, it's a post-professional amateurism. It's only a seasoned professional who can play the amateur for a certain kind of public appeal. But that's not really, don't be fooled, that's not really amateur. So those are all very interesting things, which connects us to the back of, I think, the idea of the literary public intellectual and the public humanities and the future of humanities, which are all questions very much central to this book, if somewhat indirectly. Um, but again, returning to the question of artistic disciplines, I think there's a certain productive dialectic between the professional and the amateur is kind of abiding in these disciplines. And in this matter, literature and literary criticism, the distinction is moot. It's really unimportant because they both work through language. Obviously, when you can distinguish between, say, music and music criticism because one works through language, one works through music. Same with art or visual arts criticism. But in literary criticism, the distinction collapses because we're using the same medium. So this is where I think I first got to think about it. So if you can see my second slide, reading this, the first instance of what I mean by this kind of amateur reading, ignorant reading, that I came across was this wonderful essay by Pankaj Mishra, the Indian essayist and intellectual, who wrote this wonderful essay about reading Edmund Wilson, the American critic, while he was a young student. Actually, not exactly a student. He graduated and he was just wandering and living by himself in Benares. And he walked into the library and he picked up these books by Edmund Wilson. And and he knew nothing about Edmund Wilson. And Wilson was writing about Gustave Flaubert's Sentimental Education, and he knew nothing about Flaubert either. So, but he loved reading it, and he started reading more and more of him. And then this essay is a fantastic kind of a subject which I discuss in my book, that how and that leads him to teach him something about his own surrounding, especially his friend, who's a kind of political goon of sorts, who reads and finds Wilson is telling his story. You know, the story of a caste-ridden Uttar Pradesh and the corruption of the time. He finds it reflected. And that's when I read it, I realized that this story of reading a European text, a Western text, an American text in this case, in a kind of remote periphery of the colony, with a certain cosmopolitan ideal, a certain starry-eyed idea about cosmopolitan literature, is actually not at all unique. It has been happening all around the post-colony, all around the entire global British Empire. It's been happening. And people have been wrestling with texts which they don't understand, which are not connected to their context at all. I'm thinking of even Jamaica Kincaid saying that, oh, I grew up describing snow and strawberries as my own when I'd never seen snow or eaten a strawberry. But at the same time, describing sand and palm trees as exotic, because the kind of othering that happens. Um, so this is how many colonial readers, especially early colonial readers, read Western literature, misreading the context, not knowing anything about its reality, about its history, its culture, and most importantly, even when they knew it, being essentially cut off from the physical reality, physical atmosphere, of its. And some of the most interesting cases that came up to me, which I write about, is V.S. Naipaul in Trinidad, who's also reading the French and the European Western novel in that way, and making a lot of misreading, making mistakes, and through those mistakes finding his identity. C.L.R. James talks about reading Vanity Fair some 15 or 20 times without any knowledge of the fact that it's a classic. It was almost accidental, and he kept reading it. Here in South Africa, Peter Abrahams, he reads Harlem Renaissance writers and romantic poets in a very similar way, not knowing much about them. So what I'm looking at here is what I call the colonial misadventures in reading, right? And the particular forms of misreading, um, and the particular forms of amateurish mistakes they make in those readings actually tell a different story of humanities, and actually are enabling in their making of themselves as public intellectuals. My argument is that without those mistakes, without those ignorance, they couldn't have become the kind of intellectual they became, the kind of intellectual writers, activists. They become many different things. But those mistakes, those failures were actually essential to their making. That is important. And those mistakes could only happen in this setting. Of course, this is very much connected to the larger question of British education in the colony, you know, um, British education in the colony, because, you know, because as we know, English literacy study in its current format did not quite originate in England. It originated in the colonies, particularly in India. Um, and the conventional story, which by now we all know, is that in the early 19th century, the ancient universities, Oxford and Cambridge, could not find any place for English. English was considered too lowly, too vernacular. Oh, everybody read English in their spare time. How can you turn that into a degree? Unless it's unpleasant enough, you cannot justify, doing exams or giving a degree. The prestigious subjects to study were the classics. So the classics were the subjects actually studied. The gentleman went to Oxbridge to study the classics. English was far beneath. Now something started to change as the 19th century started to roll. Basically, in Matthew Arnold's language, the barbarians were at the gates. So obviously, there were three groups which needed attention. One was the working class, who needed, were clamoring to enter the university, and there was women who were entering the university, and finally the people in the colonies. Both the colonized populations as well as the quite elite rulers of the colonials who had to pass certain exams to rule them. And the idea was that for these groups, classics was too difficult. It's too difficult. They're not smart enough to study it. So what's a good imitation subject? And imitation subject is of course English. So this is a history we know from Chris Baldick, Terry Gilton. Everybody has told us this history of very interesting history. And this has been questioned, and Gauri Viswanathan and other people have questioned it. They've said that it's not just a passive ideological process. The native actually actively sought the Western education, so it's not that simple. There's a kind of a mismatch. So that's a separate subject. I can talk more about that during the Q&A if you want to. I don't want to get into it right now. But that is a scaffolding that unites this kind of a English literary education is a scaffolding that unites much of the British Empire. South Africa's case is a little different here, though. It's a defeat in the first Anglo-Boer War of the 19th century that really was a reality check for England. And many people said that the reason we lost is our education system is very poor. Look at Germany, look at how far ahead they are. And that really kind of got them going to improve the education system and create a curriculum which eventually spread all over the colony. Of course, in the South African protagonists I discuss in my book, some of them were actually born. All of them were born after South African liberation from British rule, um, but some of them grew up before apartheid was formally instituted, um, but some of them are born later, and they are the ones who are more actively affected by the Bantu Education Act of 1953. So in South Africa's case, it's not exactly a British colonial system, but more the apartheid education system, which obviously followed British colonial rule, which created this system of excluded populations who sought a certain kind of education. So on the whole, there are three locations in my book. There are three sort of theoretical chapters about reading, amateurism, and the three physical locations. One is the English Caribbean islands, primarily Trinidad, also Antigua. There's India and there's South Africa. These are the three locations I look at in the book. And basically it's an account of how people were reading, how people were reading in spite of the curriculum, which was not really meant for a kind of liberal humanist understanding of literature, of history, of anything. It was either exclusionary, as in the case of South Africa, very instrumental, as in the case of India and the Caribbean. It was not directed. It was really set up to solve the need of the ruling classes, whether it's empire or, South Africa's case, the apartheid government. Um, but in spite of that, the people found ways of reading texts, often Western texts, not exclusively, but often Western texts, which they didn't understand and were completely confused about. But that confusion led them somewhere. There are some interesting books which are, I would say, some sort of a predecessor to the kind of work I'm doing here. One is probably the most famous one would be Jonathan Rose's Intellectual Lives of the British English Working Classes, where Rose talks about how the English working classes, the miners, the domestic servants, how they read, poetry books in mines, novels, and read between doing domestic chores. So that's Rose's account. Then there's Janice Radway's Reading the Romance, where Radway looks at book clubs, romance, and the romance reading genre. And most recently, More Vemre's Paraliterary, which reads manuals, advertisements, policy documents. But one important difference my work has with all these books is that most of these works are kind of sociological. They read a certain phenomenon. They read a certain phenomenon of a certain reading. And I also read a certain phenomenon, but my focus is actually on a certain number of exceptional figures who have what I call generative failures. Their failures are actually instructive and generative. And the other important difference is, as Jonathan Rose says, that these readers, these ordinary readers, this working class readers left no account of their reading. You had to find a lot of sociological survey, talk to people, diaries, hunt to find it. Whereas all the people I'm talking about in my book, they were themselves intellectuals, writers, activists, and they have left fascinating accounts of their own readings. right? Either it's memoirs, in some cases even novels, but most often memoirs or works of literary criticism or letters. In one of my readers, most of our readings have come from a series of letters she exchanged with her friends. So there's various evidence through which you construct this unique individual who has this imaginative life in the middle of extraordinary difficulties in the way of reading, in various kinds of difficulty. So this, I think, accounts for a certain kind of growth and development, what I call Bildung, which interestingly Matthew Arnold translated as culture. The actual translation of Bildung is education, but Arnold translating as culture tells you something, that Arnold's notion of culture as education. Um, and that obviously influenced colonial policy on education. So, as I said, this is under systems of education that are variously dysfunctional, oppressive, exclusive, provincial, mechanical, bureaucratic, in different ways, not serving the needs of the students with a full humanist conception of them, as it was the case in metropolitan locations. Either the goal was to create agents of empire or other forms of oppressive system. Now, how these individuals lived under the system and actually became autodidacts and became amateur learners, and this amateurism and autodidactism actually underlay their public intellectual identity. And that's a paradoxical process, but that is the fascinating process that we see, in the Anglophone world. So it's an intervention also in the field of English as a world language. So just to give a sense of, I don't know if this is large enough, if you can see this, but this is, I don't know if I can make it any larger. This looks pretty small to me, but yeah, maybe, oops, sorry. Yeah. So as you can see, this is the sort of the chapter division that I have in the book. The first chapter is called the colonial map of misreading, where I examine the idea of the amateur. It's very strange evolution, because for the longest time, the amateur was the prestigious thing. The gentleman amateur, the dilettante, you know, who had a lot of books, had wine, cheese, art collection, always a man, um, and um, and how that changed. How around the 18th and 19th centuries, especially around the Enlightenment, when the disciplines got grounded and established, graduate school rose, figures like Charles Eliot Norton, or um, uh, in Germany, the first research university, Humboldt, they're creating the first research universities, how slowly the amateurs started to get discredited and professionals started to get foregrounded. It's quite fascinating. Also, this is also the time when the gendered structure of the amateur also changes. Suddenly, to be professional is becomes male. Obviously, this is a kind of double dealing of the language, that whatever is prestigious and powerful is always male. So suddenly then amateur becomes feminized, whereas in the past it was exactly the reverse. So then, of course, the whole idea of aesthetic education, the kind of what I call the accident of aesthetic education, following, of course, thinking of Spivak's retelling of Kant and Schiller, and Simon During's take on that, and what kind of aesthetic education the colonial readers of metropolitan literature are enacting. So the second chapter is called Poor Reading, Weak Theory. And here I return to theories of reading. What are the various theories of reading, including those which have been discussed in the academy? Um, some I just mentioned, the idea of close reading, depth, the idea of depth, hermeneutics, but also the idea of post-critique. That there's been a kind of disenchantment with the idea of critique, and there's a kind of movement against depth. And this is where theories of distant reading, surface reading, disenchantment with critique has come into being. And this is where I introduced the idea of fail reading, or what I call even illiterate reading. And this is quite fascinating when you look at religious faith. So in religious faith, often, I think in every religion, a religious text signifies a certain wisdom, a certain power, even to illiterate people. So you don't actually need to be literate to have a relationship with a religious text. You just sort of keep it with you. You just sort of hold it with you. So there are interesting models of what I call illiterate reading, which have a role to play here. Also, I think this connects to, I think we've seen a development in critical theory in the last 7 to 10 years what is called the movement towards weak theory, sort of a certain withholding of the theoretical apparatus, um, and affect theory also, sort of, kind of an interest in all kinds of weakness, failure. Queer theory has been often very much part of this kind of an idea of failure on the horizon, um, and a certain withholding of the theoretical apparatus to let the archive regain strength. And I think have very much unconsciously been part of this tradition. My first book, so my first academic book was a book on boredom. So obviously I'm very interested in this kind of marginal effects, boredom, banality, and now I'm writing on amateurism. So in some ways I'm part of that tradition which is interested in the kind of effective failure, sort of basically the losers. So that's always been the kind of marginal thoughts and practices. So chapter 3 is called Autodidactic Nation, and it focuses on South Africa. And it's quite fascinating in South Africa. Even in the deep apartheid years, education was a very important subject, a deeply contested subject. And I asked the paradoxical question, why is it that people who are sometimes most deeply deprived of education are the ones who are most deeply preoccupied or obsessed with it? One reason, of course, is that teaching was one of the few options, one career options open to the educated African, Black African, nursing being another one. So many of these people actually became teachers, but they struggled with the idea of teaching because under the Bantu Education Act, especially the black schools were very underfunded. The missionaries contributed to some education, but it was very difficult. Even the material resources were very poor. Um, and how they dealt with education within that, first their own education, and later some of them became educators themselves. ANC, of course, has changed its position a number of times on this. Initially ANC said the first liberation and then education, and then they came to understood that education and culture are actually integral to the process of liberation. And the figures I look at in this chapter are Peter Abrahams, S.K.M. Felele, Sindiwe Magona, Luis Nkosi, Jabulo and Debele. Many of them, as I said, some of them were teachers, and they protested against the Bantu Education Act, uh, responded to the Soweto uprising of 1976. I also looked carefully at the phenomenon of drum magazine, because many of them were associated with drum magazine. And the history of drum, obviously, as you probably know, was quite fascinating how it changed from that kind of African goes to town to a kind of modern African. And it's very interesting that Drum Magazine also reflects the changing literacy of the time, because it became quite sensational and full of, kind of pictures and adventures. And it was criticized later by people like Jabulo and Devale as being sensationalist. But I think Drum is actually reflecting the literacy of the educated African following the Bantu Education Act. So I discussed that to a degree, and the kind of cultural criticism that comes out of it, right? And including the fact that many of these people like Ndebele actually become university administrators later in life. Chapter 4 is in the English Caribbean, where I think the links with pre-colonial cultures are very tenuous. So I look at people like Dion Brandt and Jamaica Kincaid, as well as older figures like CLR James and V.S. Naipaul, who look much more traditional on surface, much more pro-colonial. But if you look at them carefully, there's a lot of mischief, rebellion, and departure underneath. So it's quite fascinating when you look at their relationship with these literatures. Chapter 5 is The Light and Shadow of Empire is India, where again it is said that English literary study actually started. And then, of course, the traditional approach is that Macaulay said, oh, let's make some clerks, let's create some people with brown skin but white souls. So that's the traditional approach, but that approach has been questioned now many times over. Many people have debated that. What is the native agency in, kind of desiring that education? So I discuss all of that. And I look at a few figures. One is the figure of Toru Dutt, the 19th century poet, the female poet woman who died at the age of 21. She had tuberculosis. She's a bit something like colonial Virginia Woolf, kind of quite privileged, quite elite family, but very sick and very ill, died early. A lot of her family members died early also, and also quite isolated because they're Christians. Then this fascinating figure of Nirodsi Chaudhuri, who on the other hand lived till 103. So he only died in the 21st century. He was born in 1897. Fascinating figure. I wrote one of my earliest writings on this book was an essay in PMLA on Nirodsi Chaudhuri, how he entirely constructed a kind of a knowledge of the world from books. So there's this hilarious story that he left India for the first time in his 50s, and his plane was landing over Paris. He called the stewardess and he pointed out the streets of Paris to her, each and every street. So I don't know whether the stewardess was impressed or was irritated, but he was almost like a moving Google map. And they collected this entirely from books without ever visiting Paris. And then I look at some more contemporary figures like Arvind Krishna Mehrotra and Pankaj Mishra, and all of these people have read, they have variously articulated a disenchantment of the very boring, examination-driven, rote learning university method, and have charted a fascinating alternative reading life, alternative reading, almost a kind of underworld, almost kind of a subterranean reading life where they read things very interestingly. And it kind of sort of tell a story of the genesis of post-colonial literary tradition in English in India. Chapter 6 is called The Violence of Humanistic Education, and it is really a study of British educational policy in the colonies. In all the colonies, Asia, Africa, the Caribbean. So there's a bit of a historical study. And also I examine the idea of what it really means to read texts that are alien from one's culture, that a text which doesn't connect to you. And again, Spivak has this very interesting essay called Teaching a Text. I think she's teaching a culturally different text. And there she's looking at how to teach in the Metropolitan Academy a text from the Global South. And what are the challenges? So my project is kind of the reverse. So text from the metropolitan world read in the Global South. And I think this has a kind of added resonance in the contemporary dialogues and discussions around cancel culture and decolonization of the curriculum. So what I want to do now is to just sorry, not yet. So what I do now, I will just conclude now. I mean, I hope I've given a bit of an overview. Just want to read a few short excerpts from chapter 3, which focuses on South Africa, so that you get a sense of what I'm actually trying to do, right? Helene, are you there? Is everybody still with me?
I'm there, yes. Thanks, Saikat.
Wonderful. So I will just start, just a few excerpts I'll read. The precarious relation between education, labor, and personal growth becomes a defining concern in much of South African literature through the 20th century, even if we limit ourselves to English language writing. It takes on an urgent form in narratives of growth, be it the Bildungsroman, memoir, or the hybrid mix of autobiography and criticism, left by many, some of the most poignant, painful, and memorable of which have come from Black and colored writers. So here's one book I mentioned briefly, obviously. In Zoe Combs Link's story collection, You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town, strings together a Kunstlerroman which, though published in 1987, chronicles the growth, education, and literary development of a mixed-race woman from Namaqualand, very much like its 1948-born creator. The anxieties of a relatively prosperous mixed-race family, that of a village school principal around the career of a girl who can pass as white, seem one of privilege, say next to those of young black boys in Jabulo and the Willis collection, Fools. Even so, Wickham's Frida Shenton's anxieties and those of her father strikingly parallel the educational anxieties of colored South Africa. The very opening story of the collection, Bowl Like Hole, presents a village community flush with the excitement and importance of the arrival of the Englishman, Mr. Whedon, who comes in a big fine car, I quote, inquiring about sheep or goat or servants. In the admiration for Mr. Whedon, presented very clearly in the Shenton family, we see the hierarchy between the English, who represent civilization and sophistication, and the Afrikaners, who represent something more raw and savage, and the jagged cruelty of apartheid. Mr. Whedon is admired more because he, I quote, spoke not one word of Afrikaans, nor could he, as, I quote, for people born in England, the G's and T's of the language were impossible, barbaric. Mr. Whedon, with his admirable English speech that they do their best to emulate, leaves them with the pronunciation of the word bowl that confuses them. Bowl like hole, not bowl like howl. Wonders Frida's father, do you think that's right? Even though Frida's mother is equally confused, she knows who must be right. Of course, he's English. He ought to know. Frida's family seeks upward mobility desperately. This dream turns successful in Frida, who receives a good education, is seen writing fine essays about Thomas Hardy's novels in college. She becomes, much like Wickham herself, a successful writer who emigrates to the West to return again and write what strangely feels like the very collection we are reading, giving it a clear metafictional flavor. But the recorded experiences of Sindevi Magona, a black writer from the village of Gongulu in rural Eastern Cape, is far harsher. So let me move to this. They're the two books I read in my book. As a domestic servant who completed much of her education by correspondence in the most intense years of apartheid and Bantu education, hers is a story of autodidactism that is as harrowing as it is inspiring. The stories of the collection, Living, Loving, and Lying Awake at Night, have the painful lyricism of the life of black female domestics serving white families and an intimate conflict of rage, aspiration, and indignation. The story Joyce, for instance, is made up entirely of a conversation between two female domestics articulating this rage and the desperate hope of going beyond this life of dehumanizing labor. My mother got me this job, says the opening speaker, but believe me, I'm not going to be a maid for long. The other speaker tells her that she was a student doing matric, but her classes were disrupted by the riots. So mother said, Notumbi, go to work until this thing is over, then you'll go back to school. The statistics are appalling. Do you know how many African women doctors there are in this whole country? Five. Five, that's all. But the speaker is optimistic that, I quote, there will be six, that I promise you. The exchange continues in the staccato music of protest. There is agreement that the white mistress's idea that, I quote, the domestic worker should improve herself. But as one might expect in a country striated by sharp education appetite, I quote, I don't agree with what the improvement means. Thank you very much. But I don't want to learn to iron starched shirts better. I don't want to learn the ways of laying the most attractive table. I'll read a little bit from my writing on Peter Abrahams, who, particularly from his memoir Telling Freedom, as you know, he is a black novelist, journalist born in 1919. And I think I want to read from the part where Abrahams is sort of recalling what literature does, in this kind of consciousness. Readers of English literature in the colony live in a reality radically different from the world of literature, which they may touch through their imagination. They must reckon with this strange duality. Such too was the experience of Peter Abrahams. I quote, with Shakespeare and poetry, a new world was born. New dreams, new desires, a new self-consciousness were born. I desired to know myself in terms of the new standards set by these books. I lived in two worlds, the world of Redded Orb and the world of these books. For the world of material reality was too keenly present. Late in the night, walking alone through the white neighborhoods of Johannesburg, he could not help but marvel at the strong brick-made houses that kept its residents warm, dry, and sheltered against the intensity of wind and rain. Looking into their windows, he saw, I quote, the magic of electricity, and could not help think that, I quote, a boy could read lamb's tales without strain in such light. The book-hungry child could often see, I quote, whole walls of books in these houses and marvel, I quote, what a sight. But at every sharp turn, be it the public parks or the lavatories, reminded him with loud signs that this world was, I quote, reserved for Europeans only. But the two worlds, that of reading and that of his own reality, would soon come together against all expectations. One day he saw a well-dressed young black man in an eating house reading a paper called Bantu World, one Peter had never heard of, and whose look took him by surprise. I quote, "Yes, the pictures in the front were of black people. All the papers I had sold had only pictures of white folk." As he tried to read the paper, the young black man asked if he could read. When he said he could, the man asked him to read a bit to him, and after Peter did so successfully, the man wondered what Peter was doing there working at the market. I quote, "I want money to learn some more," said Peter. "What do you want to learn?" asked the man. "To write stories," said Peter. The man said that he might be able to offer him a job and directed him to the Bantu Men's Social Center. Tentatively arriving there in the best clothes he could find, Peter saw a black world he did not know was possible. He heard the voice of Paul Robeson, the voice of a black man, and naturally drawn to the bookshelves, he browsed through the catalog slips. Novels, history, sociology, travel, Africana, political science, American Negro literature. Taking out a fat black book titled The Souls of Black Folk by a writer called W.B. Du Bois, he turned the pages and realized that the book spoke of people who were, I quote, black, dispossessed, and denied. Skimming through the pages, these lines hit him. For this much all men knew, despite compromise, war, struggle, the Negro is not free. The Negro is not free. The line kept echoing in his head as he thought of the, I quote, reserved for Europeans only signs all over Johannesburg. The white sections, the park benches, the tea rooms, all the places he wasn't allowed. He remembered his Aunt Mattie going to jail. He remembered the spittle thrown on his face. All the while that line echoing in his head, I quote, the Negro is not free. He wondered why he had not thought of it himself. Reading it, he felt he had known it all along, but till he read these words, he felt that he didn't have the language to express the knowledge. Du Bois' word had the impact of a revelation. It was all the more powerful because it crystallized the sum total of his own life experience so far. The pain, the humiliation, the endless exclusion, the lack of voice and existence, suddenly given language with the clarity of an incisive poem. I quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea." As he read, Abrahams recognized the people in the book, but for the lack of laughter in the solemn book. Here, in our land, in the midst of our miseries, we had moments of laughter, moments of playing. Du Bois gave the young boy the key to understand the very world he inhabited. He picked up other books, Up from Slavery, Along This Way by Weldon Johnson, a slim volume called The Black Christ, a fat volume called The New Negro. Turning the pages of The New Negro, Abrahams realized that these poems and stories were written by Negroes. He had an instantaneous reaction. I quote, "Something burst deep inside me. The world could never again belong to white people only. Never again." He went on to read the words of County Cullen, Langston Hughes, Sterling Brown, Claude McKay, Georgia Douglas Johnson, and Jean Toomer, who spoke, I quote, "Caroling softly, souls of slavery, what they were and what they are to me. Caroling softly, souls of slavery." The distant lands from which these knowledges and literatures came called out to these young men, where they could live in freedom not available to them in their own country. Most of them wanted to go to America, which held the promise of hope, opportunity, and freedom. But Peter was divided between America and England. While America had limitless opportunities and the appeal of Harlem, England had Charles Lamb, John Keats, Shelley, and the poetry that had first set the young boy's mind to music. He could not decide easily. The voice of the American Negro, his freedom to voice his unfreedom, made him feel that America offered more to the black man. But England, unable to offer the comfort of the company of his own kind, I quote, could counter that call because men now dead had once crossed its heaths and walked its lanes, quietly, unhurriedly, and had sung with such beauty that their songs had pierced the heart of a black boy, a world away, another time. The last excerpt I'll read is on the part I've written on Eskia Mfelele, who obviously also born in 1919 as Peter Abrahams, writer, education activist, as you might know. Mfelele passed Standard 5 at the age of 15. Like Peter Abrahams, he too hated arithmetic. But reading was both passion and a promise of progress, particularly reading in English, of which his mother was immensely proud. She could not afford to buy him books outside the two reading books in school, one in vernacular and the other in English. The white family for which she worked gave her their old newspapers and periodicals, never bothering to ask why she wanted them. He craved for their conscious benevolence, that they realized that they were supporting an unfortunate creature who was seeking their level of literacy. He wanted them to acknowledge with admiration that he could read English. Of course, they never cared and remained unaware of his desperate attempts to read and to scavenge for reading materials. He writes, I continued to rummage for discarded, coverless, rat-eaten, moth-eaten Sanskrit books for my reading. That was how he came across an old translation of Don Quixote. He read it over 3 times, and in the process, its pages felt out. Things started to look up in Standard 6. In spite of harrowing conditions at home, he felt his career at school was taking a clear shape. Slowly, he moved ahead of his classmates in every subject but arithmetic. English poetry left a strange impact on him, particularly under the incantatory recitation of European instructors. Two of his favorites were Tennyson's Half a League, and Byron's The Destruction of Sennacherib's Host. The instructors insisted on physical action during the recitation, and the students came up with all kinds of bodily contortions to impress them. We shouted and barked at the audience. We leaped forward to show how the Assyrian came down like wolf on the fold, and stamped on the floor, and think we drowned our voices. They understood nothing of the significance of their own actions. And when they asked the teacher to explain or some of the lines, all he said was, it's poetry, boys and girls. It's poetry, can't you see? They left with that, feeling awed. As with learners who find themselves at an odd angle with institutions, Mfelele found his treasure in the school library. But it's intriguing how he expresses it. I quote, for the first time in my life since I met Sarvate, a vigorous figure in tattered garments. During my primary school years, I shook hands with notable men. They included Robert Lind, Alpha of the Plough, Addison, Steele, Goldsmith, Shakespeare, Dickens, Cure, R.L. Stevenson, Robert Herrick's. Two Daffodils became a favorite poem to read and learn by heart. As recitation and dramatics drew him, he outgrew the crude elocution displayed on the concert stage in Marabastad, yelling Tennyson's Half a League, Half a League. In 1938, he too decided to go to Adams College in Natal to get his teacher's certificate the next year. But before that, he looked for a job in Pretoria and started working as a messenger in the Department of Native Affairs for £5 a month. While his job was to carry files between his offices, make tea, and run errands for the typists, he read books in the small room where he made tea and waited for someone to buzz him for an errand. In this way, he read Stevenson's Black Arrow, Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, and a book by Scott, also reading at home whenever he found the time. A tall, thick-set lady who supervised his tea making was always knitting, reminding him of Madame Defarge, the austere and ominous knitting woman from A Tale of Two Cities. So that's all I wanted to read. What um, I think I wanted to show. I think I have um, the other figures. There are a couple of other figures I have talked about in this book. I think I'll just stop sharing now because I'm done reading the part I wanted to read. So the other figures I wrote about are Lewis and Nkosi, who was born in 1936, Jabulo Ndebele, who was born in 48. And these are people who are younger and they're more directly affected by the Bantu Education Act. And their accounts and criticism also offer very interesting accounts of reading and education. And they will obviously become a university administrator and fiction writer and essayist. And Nkosi becomes a very influential cultural critic. And Endeval's imaginative culture I find very fascinating. I've written about it in my first book, Prose of the World, as well. It's a lot like Raymond Williams's imagination of culture as ordinary when the whole ANC debate about culture was going on. And that whole debate about rediscovery of the ordinary was a fascinating space. But the interesting thing is that an immense amount of thinking about education actually comes by people who are the most embattled by it, um, people who are most deprived by it. And that really intrigues me very much. I think that really throws into kind of an ironic relief what happened to education in post-apartheid South Africa, but that's a whole other other debate. So in the end, I should say that there's a kind of a stretching of the idea of the amateur or the autodidact or the self-learner between the three different historical situations that I talk about in the book, but also within them, even these different generations of people, relation to self-learning is quite different. But in the end, I'd say a certain kind of literary critical sensibility runs counter to the diktats of institutional training, particularly in these colonial contexts. And it creates a new approach to reading. It really creates a new approach to reading, where mistakes are not something to be afraid of. Lack of knowledge is sometimes curiously enabling. We get an education where we're told that we must know what you're reading, but going by these amateur accounts of reading, sometimes not to know more is actually a blessing. You come across interpretations which are not available to the scholarly. And I think this is particularly relevant to teaching, to pedagogy, who are obviously in some ways amateurs learning to be professionals. But I think, and it's kind of worth thinking. This is something I tell often to my students, that, no matter how much you learn, how much you study, let that amateur remain inside you. Let that amateur do not become a hardened professional. And I think that this is a gesture of that, is kind of to look at the most extraordinary amateurs of postcolonial literatures who read against extremely difficult conditions. And I hope this also helps to offer a kind of an alternative history of the humanities, which might help us look ahead to its future. So I think I'll stop here today, and maybe Helene and others, if you have questions, I'm happy to take that.
Thanks so much, Saikat. We started late, so I think Hanta and I have allowed it to go a little bit over time. And I know we have a long weekend ahead of us, thankfully, us in South Africa. So I'm hoping that the people in the room will have a little bit of time maybe to spare extra today. So we'll give 10, 15 minutes for the Q&A. Maybe I'll just start, and then I'm gonna take one or two just right after my question before I give Saikat a chance to respond. So I think this obviously resonates with so many of us. I think probably everyone in this room have followed some kind of like odd journeys to the discipline of literary studies, but also have conflicted relationships with the texts of our education, of colonial education, particularly. Saikat, as I was reading your book, one of the things that struck me as really interesting is the loneliness of the amateur. There's a kind of a loneliness of the person with a curious mind who's stuck in conditions of oppression and drudgery, but also just the loneliness of someone. I'm thinking of your chapter on Bantu education, who's cut off from communities of readers due to the limits in or the obstacles to education that Bantu education put in place, but also from the a distance from the communities about whom one reads when these texts come from elsewhere. And then that loneliness is remedied to some extent through these texts, oddly. But also someone like Sandiwa Magona, I think, writes about, just the joy of discovering writing as a relief from that kind of suffocating reality of the trouble, the difficulties of accessing education. So that's kind of my question. Just have you thought about this incredible loneliness as kind of something that is central to the amateur and the autodidact? I mean, it's kind of written into that word already, that isolation in a sense. And so that's my question. And then I see Rick has his hand up as well. Rick, please go ahead.
Hi everyone. Saikat, thank you very much. Sorry, I've not been kidnapped. I was in a very noisy coffee shop, so I popped into the car to be able to ask my question. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I couldn't help think of, as you were talking about misreading, I couldn't help think of Harold Bloom's clinomen, right? Strong poets misreading other strong poets. But here we have a completely different paradigm in that it is the colonial subject who is, through this distance that he mentioned, actually performing through his weak theory approach, perhaps, a kind of strong misreading of precursor poets, writers from the metropole. So that was just something that's very interesting to me. My question, you've written, and I'm in the position of an amateur not having read your text, so I can misread it. You've given us, from what I understand, a kind of history of the amateur in the colony responding to the metropole. But that surely is something almost, I wonder, is it perhaps something of something we can now cordon off to history in the age of the internet, that this possibility of being the amateur no longer exists? And if it exists, is it the purview of the creative writer? Because all your examples are taken, the ones you read are taken from creative writers. Is the academic still in a position to have this kind of generative distance and misreading? Thank you.
Yeah, those are great question, and I think they're actually kind of related. So I'll respond first to what Helene said. Absolutely, I think in one word, you know, to be a professional is to become part of a community. That is one of the obvious requirements, or you might say even rewards, to be part of a guild, to be part of an institution, to be part of, whereas amateur is to be kind of an idiosyncratic self. And that is exactly why I think it's important in the arts, in the literature, because that idiosyncratic self is something you can never write off. You can never become a kind of collective. So I think I bring up sometimes in my classes as to which disciplines are more open to amateurs and which disciplines are less open. So it leads to very fascinating discussions. Clearly, the more scientific it is becomes more kind of consensus driven. But of course, science historically has had welcomed amateurs before the Enlightenment. You know, there are a lot of amateur scientists, but I think slowly things have become closed off. So that's actually very interesting. And what you said, particularly about the alienation of the educated African, is something I have actually directly written about in that chapter. So I'm just going to read one sentence. I think this is something I think it was S.K. Amfanella has written about quite well in the African image. I think he writes about it quite. I'll just read a couple of sentences. The result only could be the making of human beings who are strangely cut off from everything, from their traditional communities as well as from their violence of modernity. It is a lonely man, wrote Amfanella, who is not taken seriously by his own people, yet cannot go quite aloof from them and their daily miseries. And then he goes on to say how the white man also resents the educated African. So it's clearly, certainly, especially the Afrikaner white man who resents the black man speaking English, because that seems to him particularly, kind of insolent. So it's quite fascinating how, and obviously one can only imagine this, how tremendously cut off this situation must have been, how alienating it has been. And this, I think, there's something about Schiller's study in aesthetic education where it talks about the remoteness of aesthetic education. And I think I try to read that in the colonial context where it's doubly remote, where the sensory reality of the text you're reading and in any case disconnected. So you're very lonely. So yeah, it's incredibly alienating, which is why I think the kind of teachers movements, all the cooperatives were very important, as were Drum Magazine. The Drum Magazine Collective is a place. There are a lot of problems with the Drum Magazine. I think it's also quite masculinist and it's quite quite sensationalist and all that. But it did bring together this incredible group of people. So I think Dorothy Driver has written very interestingly on the Drum magazine and the short story. But it's quite fascinating how this process is absolutely alienating, and I think it's alienating anywhere. I mean, in different context, I think if you look at Toru Dutt, someone in India, she's entirely homeschooled. She's entirely homeschooled, so she's never been to a school, doesn't have friends. But on the other hand, because they're very privileged, very elite, she has access to books. So the degree of privilege and empowerment is very irregular. It's not something, there's no constant pattern. Some people are scavenging for books in waste paper, garbage bins. Some people don't have enough food to eat. Some people are actually quite privileged, but are cut off from institutional education for entirely different reasons. So there's a whole range of things, but it's fascinating how they're all reading kind of erratically, blindly, and often getting things wrong. Now, that is what I think is very different. I think Rick's point is very valued. In the age of internet, this is a big distinction. I always say that the age of internet, who's the amateur, who's the professional? Like one thing that the way Naipal or Mishra were reading, one Google search would immediately reveal, all. One visit to the Wikipedia. Now, of course, with ChatGPT, you can get answers. So, in a way, these are the last set of amateurs in the age of print modernity, and that age is kind of gone. So I think you can't have, I think the internet has given an entirely different spin. Obviously, YouTube is the video where you basically learn things, WebMD, the doctors have this whole thing that, oh, you're a WebMD patient, you've read up too much or read up not little. Some doctors like educated patients. So it's quite fascinating, what in the age of the internet, I think uh, it's a really evolving question. And now we are looking at AI. Obviously, these questions are very much dependent on technology. So an amateur in the age of print is going to be different from the amateur in the age of internet. And again, amateur in the age of AI is going to be again very different. So I think my study is really about the amateur in the age of print, because this is the people who are looking at books, but it's going to take a very different form. I think the other point you mentioned, what it means to be, I mean, part of my point, not to distinguish between creative and the critical is a distinction I personally at a certain point of time really breaks down for me. It's not useful because what I look at mostly is work of criticism. Yeah, some of them actually haven't written novels or poetry. Some of them have. Some of them, even though like someone like C.L.R. James has written novels, but is really well known for his critical work. So that distinction is not very useful. They're not academics in the sense they didn't have full-time jobs. So that's also not true. Like Jabulu Andebele was the vice chancellor of a university. So there are some of them who are actually also academics. So it's not, I don't think one can, I mean, someone like Andebele is very interesting. He, I think, is one of the finest literary critics of modern South Africa, also an amazing short story writer. So that duality is there. Nkosi, as far as I know, and Nkosi also wrote novels, right? But he's primarily known for his essays. He's kind of a Raymond Williams-like figure. So that question is, the important question, of course, is what kind of jobs they have. So for me, a definition of an academic is someone who works in an academy, by which definition almost all well-known poets in America right now are academics because poets can't make a living from poetry. They all teach, so they are academics in that sense. I think there's a part where I addressed this question. John Guillory's new book, now a couple of years old, Professionalising Criticism, does talk about that the rewards of freelance criticism is very low. You can be an independent scholar. There are some amazing independent scholars, but they're really either they have private income or something, their whatever thing is, but they almost no rewards. You publish a book, you expect a promotion, you expect a grant, you expect some sort of a professional reward. And those are the questions which I think I bring up again, that what does it mean to write? Is a public intellectual really possible? Are these the whole idea of the Bruce Robbins has written about this, that these people are free floating, they're not, but they often had powerful platforms, like people writing for New York Times or Time Magazine or some. They also have a relationship to a certain institution. It was not an institution which employed them, but they were an institution for which they had platforms which often employed them with sort of salary. So it's a very complicated question. And I think I think part of this book is written with the anxiety that the entire enterprise of literature, literary criticism, everything is, it's almost like the pie is getting so small now, it doesn't even make any sense, kind of making further divisions. Everything is shrinking. So it's a kind of a plea to think of a time when people who had so little, but so little, found everything through reading. Their entire hope, their entire liberation happened through reading. And it's kind of a mourning for the time, I guess, from the times you're living in today. If that helps to answer anything.
Yeah, thanks so much, Saikat. That was amazing. I don't know if you wanted to follow up, Rick, or if there's any other questions still lingering in the room.
I know we're running short of time, so I'll just say that Guillory was also in the back of my mind, because what you were saying was, well, what's fascinating about the amateur is that it resists this deformation that professionalization brings about. And on the one hand, the amateur now is sort of a product of precarious working conditions. It's forced on you, and through that you may enter the profession. But anyway, let me not take up more time. Thank you. That was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you. I do spend talking about Guillory's idea of deformation, because that it's any form of professionalism for Guillory is a kind of, and he's going back to Weber and other thinkers, is a kind of a deformation. You just focus on just one thing, that basically it makes you a disbalanced kind of a crooked person. That's roughly the vision. And I think in some ways this is a kind of a caveat to that, that look at these people, they're completely full of flaws and mistakes, but we got something really wonderful out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Saikat. So everyone in the room, Saikat also mailed a physical copy of the book, which hopefully will arrive soon. So I will keep it here in the department so that people can come and read it here if they wanted to. I'm sure people will. So huge thanks from the side of the English department here at UFS, Saikat, for this wonderful talk and the great book that we're all going to now read closely. And yeah, I hope we will get to do this again at some point. Since you are a research associate, we'll hopefully have more of this in future.
This has been so wonderful. I wish we just could do this in person. Maybe I will, or at least if till then I'll come online, I'll listen to your talks. And thank you, Helene. I mean, I'm so happy that, South Africa has always been a part. I'm kind of a comparativist, global comparativist, and I think South Africa has always been a key part of the things I've talked about. So it's really so amazing to be able to talk to you and see some of you and touch base. And thank you, especially Helene, for making this possible.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you to everyone for coming on a Friday afternoon. And I wish you all a lovely long weekend.